represent the President at this very important workshop. But because I am a lawyer and I like to understand my brief and the limits of my authority, I sought and received Mr. President's permission to express my own views here. So the following are my personal views. The National Assembly, the Presidential Advisory Committee on Corruption, and the UNODC deserve to be commended for this far-sighted initiative. Despite the widespread cynicism about the capacity of the political class to fight corruption, I am glad that we have found the will to open up a public discourse on this all-important subject. Let me also thank Professor Lumumba for what for me was one of the most insightful and most eloquent extempore speeches that I have ever heard on the subject. I've been involved in anti-corruption advocacy and research and action since 1990. In all of that almost 26 years, I have never heard anyone say with any seriousness that they support corruption. Indeed, everyone agrees that corruption is ultimately a fatal scourge. Many even argue that it is a crime against humanity, given the fact that in many countries, including ours, it is largely responsible for the abject poverty of the majority and the massive fatalities of the most vulnerable in our society. For the majority of our citizens, the greed and mindless selfishness that attends corruption is bewildering. How do you explain how anyone can embezzle funds meant to equip soldiers for a war that could consume thousands and eventually even all of us? Or how in the midst of so much want can some seize the treasury for themselves, their family and their friends? And how can anyone argue after all of that all that is required and all that we need to pay attention to is the technicality of how such people are possibly arrested? As the Senate President just pointed out, the fuel subsidy scam consumed almost 5 trillion naira. When you consider that the last year's budget was 6 trillion in size, the scale of the damage is clear. So I'm sure that we all agree that there is no point bringing together this most distinguished, erudite, and knowledgeable group for an intellectual exegesis of the etiology and consequences of corruption. Indeed, a conference on corruption in which the arms of government are invited can, in my view, have one objective and one objective alone, which is, what is the way out of this existential evil? So a gathering like this presents a unique opportunity to explore a consensus on how to free our nation and its most crucial institutions from the ravages of corruption. Or, as the President said famously, how to kill it before it kills us. Indeed, we have a chance to develop a uniquely Nigerian approach to dealing with this problem. I think it's important for all of us to be humble and clear-headed enough to understand that the coalition that should emerge from such a consensus is not a coalition of saints. Neither can it be a conclave of only righteous men and women bound by a holier-than-thou creed and a crusading zeal. No, that would fail. What we need is a coalition of reasonable men and women, of the Nigerian bureaucratic, political, business, and religious elite. Men and women who know that the proposition that corruption does not pay is not merely a moral injunction, that it is an admission of a grave reality in commerce, in governance, or whatever other field of human endeavor, that a corrupt executive, for example, will destroy all plans for development, that a corrupt legislature will use its legislative and oversight functions to enrich itself and compromise its role of check and balance, and that a corrupt judiciary will sell its power over life and death to the highest bidder and return society to the anarchical notion that self-help is best. That corruption in the capital market or banking system means that we cannot be sure that our investments will ever be safe. We may wake up one day to find that the banks or stocks that we put our resources in has tanked because of the dishonest acts of a few. It means that the corrupt law enforcement officer will settle personal scores with its exclusive right to use the force of state power. So the proposition that corruption does not pay is simply one that captures the self-destructive nature of the scourge. The reason why we elect men as leaders in the executive, judiciary, and the legislature, and why we appoint men into the judiciary, is that we desire an orderly society where we entrust the power to make decisions about how to spend our collective resources for the common good to a few. Because reasonable men and women discovered long ago that if we allow everyone to take care of themselves, we will remain in the state of nature, fighting like savages for our own portion of the meat. We give power to adjudicate on our lives and livelihoods to the fairest and most honest amongst us, who is called a judge. Otherwise, law and justice will serve only the strongest and the richest. So the reason why the elite in different countries of the world decide to fight corruption is quite straightforward. It is not necessarily altruistic. It is not necessarily a moral issue. But first, it protects even the elite itself from being consumed by the chaos and conflict that corruption may cause. But more importantly, because public officials and private sector persons generally observe a code of integrity, the society itself, that if public officials and private sector persons generally observe a code of integrity, the society itself is saved from a breakdown of law and order. Your Excellency, the Senate President, the Right Honorable Speaker, we have an opportunity today to begin an important national project. And I wish to emphasize that this must not be a finger-pointing exercise. What is required is a consensus of reasonable men and women who realize that the current path will destroy us all. That such a consensus will produce a coalition of the like-minded from the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, united by a common cause and a proposition, namely, that this republic will fall and consume us all if we do not put in place a practical plan to clean up our crucial public and private institutions. Thank you very much.